It all depends. But this Tuesday, I guess I kind of want to pick up where I left off a little bit yesterday. I had some really nice listeners call the office yesterday saying, "Why does Jack sound so depressed?" Because I am, for a number of reasons. I have I have a bunch of weights over my head and over my shoulders that are very difficult to deal with. On top of that is this international situation, which is a little hotter today than it was yesterday, and I'll get to that. But there is still some wonderful glimpses of hope out there on the horizon. And I think the average American probably is completely unaware of how desperate the situation is because they listen to mainstream media and they see the champions with the swords and the shields and white horses marching off to make the world safe for America. When in fact, that certainly is not the case at all. And I want to start off with something that happened back 4 days before I turned 12 years old. On Thursday, October 25th, 1962, 3 days after President Kennedy announced the discovery of the Soviet missiles in Cuba, Pope John the 23rd went on Vatican radio and asked the governments of the world to keep talking. The next morning, the very next morning, Pravda carried that appeal under the headline of Save Peace or Save the World, which quoted Pope John at length. Let leaders heed the anguished cry which from every point of the earth, from innocent children to the aged, from individuals to communities, rise toward heaven. Peace, peace. The day after Pravda reported this, Khrushchev proposed to Kennedy the exchange that ended the crisis. Get your missiles out of Turkey, we'll get our missiles out of Cuba. Now, consider the present situation. Gold, as of now, has overtaken U.S. Treasuries as the single largest central bank reserve asset as far as market value is concerned. The Treasury doubled the size of its own bond buybacks through Bessent, and the effect lasted only briefly. So on yesterday, the Secretary of the Treasury announced an operation whose stated terms are that any facility, any entity facilitating Iranian money laundering will be removed from the U.S. dollar system. And he named gold as the one of 5 sectors that would be sanctioned. Now, 3 American officials told a reporter that 40 tankers crossed the Strait of Hormuz last Friday night, carrying 16 million barrels. The claim is rather difficult to reconcile with commercial vessel tracking data, which showed far fewer recorded vessel transits. I don't know if you're aware of it. I being a pilot, though I'm not current in anything, I've got a few hundred hours in the air, but that's mostly years ago. But I have a program on my computer in my office that watches airplanes all over the entire planet. Their altitude, where they left, where they're going, speed, type, military, commercial, it doesn't matter. They're all listed there. Well, there's a program that does the same thing with ships at sea. And this program is public. You can get it yourself. And what it does is it shows in real time where the ships are at sea anywhere on the planet, and where its port of call is, and who owns it, and what kind of ship it is. And when you go back and you look at Friday night, there's hardly anything that got through at all, despite the fact that the United States said 40 tankers got through. That's not what real-time radar checking indicates. So what that costs is counted in people. The American labor force lost about 1.3 million people in the last 12 months. And that decline is especially striking in our country, whose labor force growth increasingly depends on immigration, especially as another million are to be struck from the labor rolls by spring of next year. Now, 1 million people removed from the labor force is not a statistic. This is 1 million minds a nation's leadership has decided it doesn't require. Archbishop Paul Gallagher, the Vatican Secretary for Relations with States, is in Moscow. He's meeting with Sergei Lavrov today and Yuri Yushakov tomorrow, who's President Putin's foreign aide. And an open letter released August 19th asked Pope Leo XIV to convene the heads of state of the three principal nuclear powers in the spirit of John XXIII's appeal in 1962. But Leo has already made the argument himself back July 30th of last year. So the call is to save peace. It began with Khrushchev and Kennedy, and it ended with a massive de-escalation. Now, the same kind of letter has been sent out. Just by way of mentioning it, I have seen Pope John XXIII's tomb underneath the Vatican. I don't know how we got down there, but we did. There were all of these nomadic, what's the word for them? Anyway, they have come from all over the world to pray at the tomb of Pope John XXIII. They're not praying to Pope John XXIII. They're praying at his tomb to God. And it was very impressive. We were down there for quite a while. Anyway, as I've been discussing the last several weeks and months, it's very difficult to say which of these two war scenarios, which are actually hanging together now, is the most dangerous one. Likewise, it's vacillating between the war around Iran and the war around Ukraine, one of the two to be the spearhead of the final danger. Anyway, I'm not saying that because I'm saying that one is more dangerous, the other one less dangerous, but right now the momentum seems to be shifting away from the Middle East back to the war against Russia around the Ukraine. Now, I'm not saying that the D-Day announcement of Trump this last weekend against Iran is not potentially more explosive, but I'll come back to that shortly. The thing I want you to know is that Putin, in the interview with Pavel Zarubin, recently expressed his extreme conscience and awareness of the fact that it is the policy of the West, quote, to cause the collapse of the Russian economy, end quote, which is a state of warfare directly between NATO and Russia. And that situation could explode even as I'm talking this morning, because all the conditions are essentially fulfilled for what we have been told is coming. Russian countermeasures. Lavrov has talked about it. Putin has talked about it. The hundreds of drones and missiles that Russia has sent into the Kyiv area, taking out power stations, taking out gas stations, taking out highways before winter hits this year, is not the countermeasures that Lavrov and Putin were talking about. And I think the most obvious point of escalation right now is the fact of the reaction by Putin and Lavrov to the provocations of Great Britain to deliver Storm Shadows and other long-range missile systems to the Ukraine. Also by Russia calling back, as I said yesterday, its ambassador, who's been in London for 7 years, without replacing him, I think clearly shows the heightened situation. And basically all central communication channels between Great Britain and Russia are non-existent anymore. And therefore, even a British former military attaché is warning of an unwanted armed escalation. Now, the Times of London just reported that the Ukrainian National Day in Kyiv, which was just a little while ago, British Prime Minister Andrew Burnham, actually I think it's today, if I remember right, the Ukrainian National Day in Kyiv, I think it's today. Anyway, British Prime Minister Burnham is going to hand over papers which will enable the Ukraine to build the missile based on the UK-French Scalp type. Do you hear that? Do you hear what I just said? Today at the national celebration in Kyiv, the British Prime Minister is turning over the paperwork, the blueprints, the engineering printouts, whatever else goes with it, so that the Ukraine can build a missile based on the UK-French Scalp type missile. This is for long-range strikes deep into the territory of Russia, and other governments are likely to follow. Germany, for example, is likely going to supply the Ukraine with blueprints for missile production between Germany and the Ukraine and Great Britain. And there's this bilateral defense agreement, the so-called Trinity House Agreement that was signed in July 2 years ago between those countries, Germany, Ukraine, and Great Britain. So there is coming a Russian reaction to this. The countermeasures. It's one thing to do a tit for tat. You bomb us here, we'll bomb you there. It's another thing when a nuclear power says enough is enough and countermeasures are coming. What will the reaction, what will the Russian countermeasure be? Because I'm sure it's coming. It could be an Oreshnik hitting Schoppenhausen, where the Taurus is being produced, or any of the other 12 listed sites. I think it was yesterday I talked about that. Russia has published in public newspapers 12 sites that they know of where missiles are being assembled for use against Russia. Now, what would you do about that? Jeez. If you knew more of your citizens, more of your oil refineries, more of your shipping ports, more of your radar systems, more of your energy centers would be targeted by missiles that are being manufactured, and you know where they're being manufactured, what would you do about it? And the fact that the National Day in Kyiv is being used for all the kinds of heads of state to gather there. Today, I think. The German Foreign Minister Wattefel was already, they're preparing for all of this, and naturally you have the EU Commission present because they've commissioned Kyiv to spend 6.1 billion euros for defensive systems, which is part of the 90 billion package by the EU in general to the Ukraine to continue their war against Russia. Now, this is very advanced and this is very hot because the Russians have not failed to respond to things in the past when they said they would respond. They didn't respond overnight. They didn't respond a week or two later. They didn't respond until it was time to respond. And when both the foreign minister Lavrov and the president Putin, remember, he's got a 70% acceptance by the Russian citizens, are saying countermeasures are coming. And they've published 12 sites where nastiness is being prepared against them. You know, Putin had recently, just a few days ago, mentioned not only that the hesitation is now over and the tit for tat is going to accelerate. That means including that Russia is sort of announcing for the first time that they might be getting ready to hit civilian targets in the Ukraine, which they have not done so far. And so this is definitely extremely worrisome because Ukraine continues to hit civilian targets in Russia. So there's no question that the overall intention is the disrupting and the dismantling of Russia. And along with these things that the West is trying to do to Russia, they're trying to contain China, or worse. In any case, the Department of Defense is going to be hosting an industry day from September 14th to 16th in Chantilly, Virginia, where they're going to show some homemade family of hypersonic weapons. That's what it was called. The homemade family of hypersonic weapons, basically described as a family of next generation maneuverable and precise hypersonic weapons capable of defeating advanced defense architectures, just as Iran has been doing with Israel and American bases. So that's clearly going on. Now, Chantilly there, that's where Dulles Airport's located. I wonder if this industry show is going to be taking place in Chantilly. Okay, so the other war theater, the Middle East or Southwest Asia, the largest economic warfare operation ever, this D-Day against Iran is supposed to start. I mean, this is, what has to be taken seriously because it shows the intention of the Trump administration to still go for regime change, even if that's proven to not be achievable in 5 months of military war so far. Somehow we're going to go in there and reverse the results of the last 5 months where the U.S. and Israel were defeated by Iran. But this time it's going to be so big that Iran's regime will finally fall, the people will finally be free, and the war with Iran will finally come to an end. Now, nevertheless, this is intended to be an escalation. However, if you look at it closely, first of all, the reason why the Trump administration clearly is doing this, because they have no military options left. They could not defeat Iran. They've had 5 months to do it, and they can't. How do we know Iran won? Because they have control of the Strait and the Red Sea. And the threats have come out. I don't know if it came out of Oman or if it came out of Iran, where any more innocents are attacked or hurt, that Oman and Iran will close both both passageways completely. Now, the Western powers are low in stockpiles of missiles and interceptors in that part of the world, while the Iranian military equipment seems to be in relatively good shape and expanding. We've had good, reliable intelligence reports that tell us they're building more missiles than they're launching, because they've been doing this for 47 years. They knew with the overthrow of the Shah what would be coming their way, and they've been preparing for it. So Russia and China already have made it clear that they have no intention of obeying the sanctions order, the secondary sanctions order against Iran. And Iran, contrary to the US, has many options in terms of trade. They can use the route to China via Central Asia. They have a route via the Caspian Sea to Russia. And they can use the Pakistani ports. So the Iranian situation is a lot better than ours. And there is clearly underneath all of this a change in the architecture that's already going on. One expression is the ongoing Egyptian-Chinese Air Force exercise that's taking place, which according to Chinese sources represents this gradual shift in the regional security dynamic, so that it's not just US-Israel that controls this area of the world, but China and Egypt are having combined military operations. Well, you know where Egypt is. Maybe something's taking place over there. I mean, one that highlights declining confidence in Washington to defend their interests anymore, and Beijing's expanding security role, and the ever-increasing movement of the world toward multilateralism. So this so-called Mecca alliance, which has been poo-pooed by several of the American analysts, they basically say this is nothing. If you look at the sources from the region, they take it much more seriously, of course. First of all, Bangladesh has now indicated they want to become part of it. And so that would be Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and then soon Bangladesh. And if you look at the position of Bangladesh and Pakistan, they have something between the two of them called India. So this is clearly in response to, I think, a lot of regional tensions, including Modi's over closeness with Israel. So analysts from the region are saying that there are many other Muslim countries from Southwest Asia who are interested in joining it, and 21 Muslim countries in Africa. And that the key difference to NATO and Article 5 of NATO and this Mecca alliance is that NATO has an absolute security idea position with Article 5, while the new Mecca alliance has a cooperative security clause, which basically says security of one cannot be at the expense of the other, and there's heavy emphasis on joint development between them. Do you understand what this means? This is unheard of in the last 500 years. And with gold now taking a greater reserve position in the World Bank against all the U.S. treasuries they're holding on to, you see what's happened to the price of gold and silver in just the last week. So this is definitely an emerging new security structure, still in baby form and somewhat nascent, but nevertheless one which absolutely opens the potential for some good peace alternatives like the extended OASIS plan. Now, it's reported that apparently the Mecca alliance did invite Iran to join. This has been reported by TASS. and they report that the matter is being presently investigated by the Iranians. And obviously, this would be a gigantic geopolitical change in the region, probably building on the mediation by China between Saudi Arabia and Iran from a couple of years ago. And that obviously is very interesting in light of the fact that the offer of joint development is much more attractive than the methods that have been used by the US and principally London, Wall Street, and Washington of bribery to get what they want. And what the global South and China are offering is development. Water projects, canals, desalination, and more hospitals, highways, agricultural products. So there's reports by Pepe Escobar. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's part of the team at Napolitano podcast. He's on once a week. And he's a real talking machine. He never slows down. He's like a fire hydrant of information and intelligence. And he said something very interesting in his last appearance. He claims to have absolutely impeccable sources that Trump supposedly tried to bribe the Iranian leadership, especially the military leadership, according to the way he bribed the Venezuelan military. Basically, when he offered the vice president of Venezuela protection if she would cooperate with the takeover of Venezuela. So in that model, according to Escobar, Trump had tried to do the same thing with Iran. So this report says that already in May of 2026, the Trump administration tried through a man called Barzani, the president of the Kurdistan region in Iraq, several channels to Vahidi, who is the head of the IRGC. Supposedly, this was done via Tulsi Gabbard at the time, and it was offering several millions and high sums of millions of dollars, basically as a bribe for several members of the leading power of the IRGC. And so this Vahidi is obviously the commander of the IRGC, and obviously the deal did not find a very fruitful response. But I think it needs to be included because Pepe Escobar has usually very good intelligence to report. And I think that's very, very interesting. And I suppose there's a chapter in Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, that focuses on bribery. Now, as I said, the Mecca Alliance and its relationship to BRICS and the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, this is evolving in a very interesting way. I mean, obviously, the BRICS is still a major factor, and Pakistan is, of course. And Pakistan is now a full member of the SCO. And in any case, the BRICS summit that's coming up in September, one can expect, I think, to be a very major event because, among other things, Putin is going to be there. And to prepare it, the Indian foreign minister is presently in Moscow preparing for it, emphasizing the India-Russia partnership, which would have demonstrated some resilience, adaptability, because they have not always been friends. But there is some confidence being developed now in some bilateral relationship between Russia and India. And the Indian foreign minister will also be meeting with Lavrov. So, as I usually say, what does this mean? What is the meaning behind this? All these kinds of, I would have to call them tectonic changes that are going on, where they're not looking for approval from the United States anymore. They're not looking for approval from London. They're making all these deals between themselves. And right now, as Xi Jinping has been saying for some time, the world is undergoing dramatic changes that it hasn't seen in 100 years. I think it's also undergoing changes that have not been seen in 500 years because of the end of colonialism. And it's not yet clear how this new world order is going to shape up. But you have different parts of the world preparing for very different conceptions of what this new world order could look like. Now, just a couple of suggestions. Russia, for example. Russia is clearly, in one sense, the country which has been, how do I say this, is best prepared to weather out all crises. Why? Because Russia has everything they need. Russia, unlike any other country, except for maybe China, has all the elements of the periodic table. We don't. They have all the raw materials in Russia to build what they need. Militarily, infrastructure, as far as infrastructure is concerned, for their public interest. They have the largest territory of all countries in the world, 11 time zones. And in the continental United States, we have 4. A third of the Russian time zones. And so, in a certain sense, Russia is in a very comfortable position. And if you if you don't consider the possibility of global nuclear war, thank goodness, Russia could sit out any changes more easily than any other country. So right now, for example, they are cultivating new varieties of grain and other foods against all kinds of climate changes. That's one thing. And then naturally, you have NATO that is in transformation, which was discussed here recently at the Ankara summit, or Ankara, which is demanding more and more self-responsibility of Europe. It just means to have a larger portion of the financial burden while Washington keeps control. Those who participated in the Ankara summit. Washington keeps control over all the strategic instruments, ranging from nuclear weapons and long-range missiles and secret services and digital infrastructure and artificial intelligence. But that they have control autonomic, not atomic, but autonomic, well, whatever. So this is a new transatlantic division of labor, more risks and burdens for Europe, and more decision power for the United States. And that's a factor which hampers the sovereignty of Europe tremendously. Now, where's this coming from? Especially the Silicon Valley types and people who are thinking likewise. As I said, this is this Ankara thing is, I think, a couple of weeks ago. Because what is shaping up from the old world order to the new world order is this form of neo-feudalism, where the power of the state is essentially dismantled and more private structures, naturally under the care of the billionaire oligarchs, are replacing this. And they call this coming disruption there's a creative disruption of the economy. And they apply the notion to the political scene. And what I mean is part of that, for example, that more and more the public discourse is being destroyed. They don't want to hear what you have to say. They don't want to hear what your troubles are, what your suffering is. And as a result, you have Many countries where public demonstrations have completely disappeared, like in Germany. And while the situation is far worse than in the 1980s, there is almost no public, small groups here and there, but not the hundreds of thousands that filled the streets in Germany back in the 1980s when they didn't like something the government was doing. And it's now reported that Peter Thiel, and you know Peter Thiel, and his protege, J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, has this intention. I just picked this up. Perhaps you're familiar with it. Has this intention to create cities in the oceans on floating pontoons, which would not be under the control of any state, but would be basically private businesses somewhere in international waters. And the Gaza Monster project was one example of what they're trying to do. Now, I don't know if they're still going to try this, but it's being talked about. Now, basically, all the different private properties, like you see in Rio, where the rich people live on the hills surrounded by walls and protected by private security, while the mob is living in the multi-unit dwellings at the foot of the mountains. This is essentially the model for what they're doing. There is apparently in Honduras already a private city called Prospera on an island called Roatan. So I think this neo-feudalism, which you can see is the concentration of food production, and I think we have to really put some emphasis on this if we're going to understand this, that there is a mixture between techno-fascism, these are the words you're hearing, techno-fascism, neo-feudalism, and the utmost militarism. And I think that this utopia that they're talking about, or dystopia, is really something that we need to be a little bit more conscious about. Now, obviously, all of this is a falling apart type of thing, which Germany is absolutely in free fall. There are now two letters, one from big industry, big enterprise, and the industrial associations, and a second letter from the German Mittelstand, which absolutely denounces the current government policies for finance and economics and this absolute chaotic conduct of Merz. And they warn that if there's not a sudden change, it's going to lead to the collapse of the entire government. Now, there is in the Western world, which is obviously in chaos and disarray, if you compare it to the way the Chinese model is offering, a completely contrary idea. There is now a new study by Nanjing University published in the Quarterly Journal of International Politics, which analyzes the data from 197 countries in the regions between 2000 and 2023. And they can demonstrate that the 146 countries that were cooperating with the Belt and Road Initiative in this period did absolutely significantly better. And the 10 years, or I guess by now it's 13 years, of the Belt and Road Initiative, that all the arguments that this would lead to a debt trap and impoverishment of the participating countries is completely wrong, and the opposite is true. They can demonstrate in great detail that the projects improved logistics, expanded production capacity, led to more revenue, improved debt repayment capacity, and reduced the country's overall debt burden of 146 countries. Then they cite certain projects like the China-Laos Railway, the Jakarta-Bandung High-Speed Railway, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. These infrastructures are improving regional connectivity, where they don't have to rely on the international banking system because they're financing it themselves. through systems that are gold backed. And I think this is definitely, I mean, nobody in the whole global South has any doubt about the success of this kind of stuff because it's their experience. And therefore, the best the West can do right now is study what China did and what the West in its neoliberal model created August 15th, 1971, when Nixon took the dollar off of the gold reserve. And what is the difference and what mistakes right now could be corrected by the West by following the China model? And the China model is essentially you go into these countries and you help rebuild them. And you break them away from the chains of debt of the International Monetary Fund. And you create situations where their citizens want to stay because they can make a good living. And so what this study out of Nanjing shows is that 146 countries have improved in almost all the areas of economics in the last 13 years because of that model. Now, look at the situation here in our country. What time is it? Obviously, this is one of utmost turmoil that's going on right now. I mean, Trump is losing it. In the morning, he's going to bomb Iran. In the evening, he's going to turn back to diplomacy. And then the next morning, he's going to open up the Straits of Hormuz. That evening, claiming the straits are completely open. And then the next morning, announce a D-Day attack against Iran. I'm afraid my president is completely losing it. And now he's ranting about the losers, the defectors. Tucker Carlson, Thomas Massie, Marjorie Taylor Greene, he calls them fools. He calls them losers. You know, in any case, it's really just horrible to see a president of the United States acting like this. And I think one should take into account what Ray McGovern has repeatedly said in several podcasts lately. Ray McGovern is a former CIA analyst, an intelligence officer. It's one thing to be a member of the CIA on the ground in a foreign country, gathering data. It's another thing to be an analyst at Langley, analyzing all this data that's coming in, advising the director on what's taking place so the director can advise the president and sometimes Congress on the intelligence that they've been gathering from around the world. That's where Ray McGovern was for decades. And he has repeatedly in several podcasts lately that he's been involved with, warned. Now, I want you to hear this. He's been warning that he is extremely concerned about the preparations that are being made by ICE right now to intervene in the midterm election. And he repeatedly said that he thinks that there are clear preparations not even to have a midterm election. Which I can't say yes or no either way. But if Ray McGovern is concerned about this, this needs to be looked into. So otherwise, naturally, the situation is, not very pretty. But in Omaha, Nebraska, the first public school system now intervened with the school board against ICE agents being allowed to use electric shock gloves on school property. I mean, this is just totally wild. My goodness. And I told you about these electric shock gloves. You probably know about them. Instead of shooting a taser across the room, they now wear these gloves that are insulated for the person wearing them. But on the external surface of the glove, It's like an electric eel. And you can disable somebody just by grabbing them with the glove. So if you look at this situation in totality, I mean, it is crying for a higher order of level. And this letter that has been put together by the Schiller Institute, well, it's not put by Schiller, but Schiller signed it, to the Pope, for the Pope to come forward and do what Pope John the 23rd did in 1962. To bring these nations together and to sit down and talk. But that's not what the oligarchs want. The oligarchs want absolute total control of the productive capability of this planet. They have no allegiance to national sovereignty. Their allegiance is to gold. That's not the first time this planet suffered from that kind of megalomania. But when you look at the history of the Cold War, it was just an absolute, probably accidental circumstance that the Cold War did not explode into a hot war. But now we're in that same vicinity. And if you have looked at many of the videos by Ted Postel and Stephen Starr that I told you about, that once you get in the range of an accident or a miscalculation, nuclear strategically speaking, or whatever, you literally have only minutes, a few minutes before mankind is over with. And I think that all the other activities that are going on, trying to head off the potential extinction of civilization, but should the oligarchs get their way, everything else that looks like a good idea will essentially mean nothing. And then again, I call back to the initiative of the Pope convening a conference. It's absolutely feasible. So, the Vatican has already stepped out. You know, it's a country. The Vatican is a country. And it has gotten in the middle of China and Taiwan. The Vatican is one of the few countries that recognizes Taiwan as a country, apart from China. You know, we have here the one China policy in the United States. In our foreign policy, there's one China, yet we act like there's two. And the Vatican, through Pope Leo, trying to get to a point where you get these, not the oligarchs, but the heads of state, together to sit down and get this thing straightened out. Now, I wanted to say one thing about Bessent's D-Day announcement. Secretary Bessent yesterday announced this much anticipated economic D-Day assault on Iran, the second set of new economic sanctions to be levied against Iran since this thing began. And these sanctions have been given the name Operation Economic Outcast. Were announced by Bessent hyperbolically, I mean the most hyperbolic sanctions ever imposed by the most hyperbolic administration in the entire known history of human hyperbole. To wit, quote, from Bessent, the single greatest financial offensive ever marshaled against an adversary. And from President Trump this morning, early this morning, Truth Social said, Iran is completely collapsing, which was actually before Bessent's announcement came out. And according to the Treasury website, I was looking at this, Bessent said, any entity that facilitates any entity that facilitates money laundering on behalf of Iran will be removed from the US dollar system. The clock is ticking. It says this, the new sectorial sanctions determinations issued today target 5 of Iran's most vital lifelines that it exploits to other countries: digital assets, technology, gold, aviation, and shipping. And when he was asked whether Chinese banks which finance Iranian oil imports would be targets of the financial punishments, Bessent said, no one is above the reach of U.S. sanctions. Wow. Not the firmest of all affirmatives, but he sharply criticized the UAE for trading with Iran, but did not threaten it with sanctions, because the UAE had recently suspended trade with Iran due to an Iranian attack. So Bessent reportedly said that President Trump is calling world leaders to get them to break connections with Iran, but did not name who they were, nor when the president was calling them, according to CBS. And you know what Russia and China has already said to Trump and Bessent about this D-Day thing. They essentially gave him the middle finger. All right. A little bit about nuclear war planning. I think this is interesting. Last Saturday, a publication called Vox Populi, the voice of the people, published an article on a 1949 Strategic Air Command war plan called Off Tackle, which called for a huge strike against the Soviet Union, while a joint military evaluation warned that logistics and expected bomber losses made an offensive of that scale impossible to sustain. It said this: Strategic Air Command might have delivered many weapons during the opening attacks, but it risked burning through bombers, trained crews, fuel tankers, forward bases, and assembly teams before the wider campaign was finished. Getting one wave through was not the problem. Repeating it was. So this Kevin Montine, who wrote this article, cites this 1949 report by an Air Force panel called the Harmon Board, which assumed that atomic attacks could neutralize roughly 30 to 40% of Soviet industrial production. It also estimated 2.7 to 4 million injuries, 2.7 million deaths and 4 million injuries, figuring that, the staggering human consequences were prepared to contemplate this at the dawn of the Cold War. Montine says this: yet the board did not believe bombing alone would force Soviet capitulation. It warned that the attacks might instead unify the population and strengthen its will to fight, while Soviet armies would seize much of Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia before industrial disruption slowed them. In other words, unprecedented destruction still did not answer the oldest military question: what happens next? So the documents that Montine links to have been online for years, and the technology and operational concepts of nuclear war have changed considerably since 1949, but the question of what happens next is as relevant as ever. So to summarize that, it's one thing to launch this massive invasion, air, sea, and land, that they were planning in 1949 in an operation called Off Tackle. Which called for this huge strike. And the dissenting voices said, yeah, we could hurt them. But could we keep hurting them? Is the answer. And when you're talking about a country with 11 time zones, all the elements of the elemental chart, the periodic table, including the rare earth materials needed for missile guidance today that we didn't have back then. If these missiles continue to be delivered to the Ukraine, and Russia holds back on the consequences that they have warned repeatedly is going to happen. Not that they might, but that they are going to happen in Russia's old good old time. The relevant question is, what happens next? If Russia should, in fact, hit any of those 12 missile construction sites with an Oreshnik, it only takes one to completely destroy that missile facility. What would happen next? Would these countries follow Article 5 of NATO? The attack against one is an attack against all, and respond accordingly? And Ted Postel and Stephen Starr's warnings that there wouldn't be a limited exchange, that it would immediately expand into everything. Something to think about. And then McGovern's comments about the midterm elections being interrupted and suspended. They could come up with a number of reasons to suspend the midterms. Wow, we got an incredible fall coming, don't we? And as bad as things look, there's a bright, shining light of hope out there in these countries that are coming together, turning their backs on London and Wall Street, creating their own financial organizations, loading up their central banks with gold, developing these other nations so they can do business with them. Because that's what the Chinese are specialists at doing. China's never attacked anybody. China doesn't want to attack anybody. China's been attacked several times. China just wants to do business. And look at how they have lifted 800 million, more than half their population, out of poverty over the last 20 years, to where they have at least middle-class lives, supporting their families, and allowing more than one birth. Now, I don't think the PLA is going to disappear soon, but I just wanted to finish that with the idea. Let me stop the recording here, and I need to turn the programming over to Lyle. Lyle, good morning, Lyle. Turn the programming over to the next hour as the live broadcasting of K-Talk continues. I'll be back tomorrow with a health program with some ideas in preparation for the fall and things that are coming, I think, that you will find relative. But Lyle, I'm going to turn the broadcast and control of broadcast over to you right now, sir. It's all yours. Keep your wits about you. Thank you very much for your listenership and keep